Welcome to the Brelin Show. Coming at ya.
Welcome back, and for all of our new listeners out there, my name is Helen,
And my name's Bridget.
and this week's topic is the prison system.
I don't know about you, Helen, but I'm very excited about this topic.
Me too. I think it's important that we talk about this. I really didn't know a lot of this stuff until we started doing the research.
Me neither. Let's dive in. First, let's talk about the stigma surrounding people who've been to prison and just prison in general.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people don't really understand what it's like to be in prison or what being in prison consists of. And I was actually just reading this essay called In Spite of Prison by Angel Sanchez, and in it he actually cites Angela Davis.
You mean the political activist?
Yes, for those of you who aren't familiar, she was a really big voice in the civil rights movement. And she actually says that people find it difficult to imagine a world without prisons, yet they are largely unaware of what goes on inside of prison and believe it is reserved for evildoers.
There are a lot of common misconceptions about prison, and we spoke to expert Jolie Sparkman to get to the bottom of it.
And first, we want to provide you with a little bit of background information about Jolie. She is a case manager and board member of Bethany House Ministries, which is an organization that helps newly released prisoners kind of reintegrate back into society.
She also works with Project Place, which is a similar organization, and on their website there's a little bit of background information about her.
In an article by Susan Ryan Volmar, it describes her upbringing in Rochester, New York, as categorized by abuse, abandonment, and familial incarceration and substance abuse. As a teenager, Sparkman became involved with abusive men and engaged in survival crimes as she struggled to provide for herself and her 3 children.
We asked both about her clients' experiences in prison and her own.
When we asked her if guards would ever intentionally humiliate or dehumanize prisoners, she was quick to answer.
She said, about the guards, that their purpose is to break you down and dehumanize you until you're not yourself. Then, they build you back up again, the way they want you to be. She also mentioned that the longer guards worked there, the more violent they became.
This lines up well with Sanchez's essay, where he explains many guards often use their authority to entertain themselves and each other by thinking of ways to humiliate and dehumanize prisoners.
That's really disturbing.
I know. He mentions one of the humiliating acts that guards had prisoners do kind of for their own entertainment was during strip searches, when they would have inmates put their fingers in their mouths, and when they coughed, they had to repeat it again and again until everybody did it in unison and it was loud enough for the guards.
Ugh, that's awful. It's terrible to see people manipulating their power like that. But it reminds me of a story Jolie told us about one of her clients who had a guard who pointed their flashlight at her while she was in the bathroom.
And that's awful too, because they can't really do anything about it or else they'll get in trouble.
Yeah. She also talked about the sex between guards and prisoners in exchange for drugs and other contraband.
And so it's kind of clear by now that there's a lot of sexual violence and, sexual assault happening in prison, between prisoners and between guards. But I think that the people that are most often directly affected by it are people in the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, I completely agree. I was just reading about this case, Farmer vs. Brennan, where a trans woman was brutally raped and beaten after being transferred to general population at a male prison. She sued the warden for violating her 8th Amendment rights and won.
Jolie also introduced us to PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which kind of establishes some basic regulations and procedures that a prison should follow through with when somebody is raped inside. She also mentioned that only a few states are good at upholding that, and in many, the victims and the perpetrators are not kept separate, or they are both put in solitary confinement, and neither of them get adequate counseling.
Ugh, every time I think it can't get any worse, it does.
Yeah, I was really shocked by some of the basic health violations that are committed in these prisons.
I know. I was just reading an article about MCI Norfolk. It's a prison in Massachusetts where prisoners didn't have clean water for a really long time until medical symptoms started showing up in prisoners.
That's really similar to what Jolie was telling us about asbestos, which was in actually in the windows where prisoners were staying, and it's so bad that when guards go inside, they will wear masks just to be inside there for like 5 minutes, and prisoners are in there 24/7 and are not provided with any sort of medical care, and they're not tested for cancer or for infertility, and then they come out sick and people don't know about it and nothing's being done. Speaking of healthcare, when we asked Jolie whether she thought prisoners were provided with adequate healthcare, she said that the prison actually chose healthcare providers based on the lowest bidder. So, in other words, the person who will do it for the least money gets to do it. And that pretty much means, they get kind of the worst services.
Another major issue in prisons is the abuse of solitary confinement. We have another quote from Angel Sanchez. Note that he is describing a time when he was 15 years old. Without being old enough to have a career, I was labeled a career offender and sentenced to 3 more concurrent 30-year sentences. I was happy to go to prison just to get out of that isolation cell.
So you're saying that essentially he was so affected by his time spent in solitary confinement that he was willing to go to prison for another 90 years just to get out?
Yeah, pretty much.
Jolie also had some stuff to say about solitary confinement. She told us that a lot of times prisoners would be put in solitary confinement kind of like for their own safety or because they were a danger to others, but it was more like a tool that guards could use to abuse them, just like sexually or physically, without anybody witnessing it.
She told us a little about the environment in solitary confinement. It was loud, chaotic, and frightening. People would scream and yell, bang on doors, and make animal noises. It's enough to make anyone feel insane. The guards would even control the temperature, try to make it cold enough that people would get in their beds and go to sleep, but nothing worked. Sanchez also wrote that officers ordered other prisoners, the orderlies, to put empty food trays in the cells so that it would appear on the surveillance camera as if prisoners had been fed.
So you mean they literally just could starve them because they weren't eating in the main area with everyone else?
Yeah, and they got away with it.
It's really like the guards just controlled everything. I mean, it's like they control where you sleep and when you sleep, what you eat, even the temperature, like the environment that you're in.
It's like you're not even your own person.
Yeah. Next, we'll talk about the challenges in returning to society from prison. But first, a brief message from our sponsors.
Belinda's Bakery. Get 15% off your first order. It's the yeast we could do.
Open Wide Dental Care. Brace yourself for our impeccable cleaning skills.
Frank's Flapjacks. Home of the best flapjacks on this side of the Mississippi. And we're back
with some new information. Alright, so we've talked a lot about what it's like inside prison and, the kind of the effects that can have on a person, but we haven't really talked about what it's like to come back from that. Jolie kind of talked to us a little bit about what it's like to kind of return to life and to relearn sort of mundane tasks like balancing a checkbook or using money, paying for stuff. And that's why it's so important for the work that she does at Bethany House. She helps people sort of relearn all these tasks and like get jobs and kind of how to like interact and reintegrate into society really smoothly. It's so important that she's doing this work that she does because a lot of the programs outside of the prison system, that are accessible to people once they're out, they won't take people if they have, a violent crime on their record. So Jolie herself actually tried to get into 17 different programs before Project Place took her in and helped her.
Those are just the programs provided from outside of prison, though. What is accessible to people from within prison and is provided by the prison is a process called Pathways. It organizes people into groups based on their psychological state and the nature of crimes they commit, and puts each group in its own pathway to re-entry.
Pathways isn't a super effective method of rehabilitation, though, and one of the reasons is that it doesn't organize people at all by life sentence. So you could have people who are serving maybe just a couple months and people who are serving life sentences or years in the same program following the same path to reentry. And another problem with that is that you could have people who are serving life sentences being told to write letters home about when they're going to come home, to their families, and they're never coming home because they'll be there for life.
That's really horrible, and a lot of victims of these crimes agree with me. I was looking at an infographic presented by the Alliance for Safety and Justice, and I learned that 3 times as many victims believe that prison is more likely to lead someone to commit crimes than to rehabilitate them. And an overwhelming majority, 7-to-1 victims, would prefer more funding for at-risk youth programs and crime prevention than funding for jails. That means we should be putting more effort into helping troubled people before they resort to crime, rather than punishing them after it's been done. On top of all of that, twice as many average people believe that the prison system should be for rehabilitation and not punishment.
Right. So this is what needs to happen. We need more volunteer programs set up at these prisons to educate prisoners and to provide therapy and counseling. We also think that mandatory therapy should be a thing for everybody who's in prison. Everybody needs help, and a lot of people don't get it. Only very few people actually get access to the health care they need, including mental health. Solitary confinement also has to be eliminated.
It's psychological torture.
Exactly. Nobody should have to go through that. Also, we don't think that Pathways is the best way to rehabilitate people. We think that there should be a new program put in place, maybe one organized or supported by volunteers. One that maybe focuses less on the nature of someone's crime and more on the length of their sentence.
Keeping all of this information in mind, there's still people who believe that prisons should be even harsher. In an article that we read from the Telegraph, they provided a counter-argument for rehabilitation. The author argues that prisons should be based on harsh punishment because it will make society safer.
Hopefully we don't have to explain to you why that thinking is flawed, considering all of the research that we just presented.
Yeah, that's complete baloney.
Now, in case you wanted to learn more about this topic, we're going to end this eye-opener of a story with a book recommendation that was given to us by Sparkman. It's called A World Apart: Women, Prison, and Life Behind Bars by Christina Rathbone, who was incarcerated in MCI Framingham.
And we want to give a special thank you to Jolie Sparkman for helping us in doing everything she does.
Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Bye!
Bye!